Okay. Well, hi, I'm Brittany Newberry, the Music and Popular Culture Archivist here at Georgia State University Special Collections and Archives. And I have Morna Gerrard here. Do you want to introduce yourself? You're muted.
Thank you. I am Morna Gerrard. I'm the Archivist for Women's and Gender and Sexuality Collections here at Georgia State.
Awesome. Thank you. So today we're going to go over how to plan for an oral history project. The session is being recorded and will be shared later. So if you have to leave early or if you're watching us later, welcome. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So we're going to be talking about project planning, as I mentioned. On the screen, you'll see a QR code and you can scan that to go to our planning document. And I don't know where chat is for some reason, but I'll share the link in chat after so you can go to it as well if you can't scan. But if you scan that QR code, you should be able to view it in Google Drive and download it as a Word document or PDF and answer the questions when you get into project planning or follow along with us. But we've just created this handy document to help you with planning your oral history project. So today we're going to go over basically planning for an oral history project, whether you're an individual working on a research project or an organization working on recording your history. You will need to plan ahead of time the project before jumping into it. You just don't want to go feet first and figure out as you go. We recommend planning. So on the screen are the aspects of project planning we will be discussing today. So we'll go over your goals for the project, who's your audience, the scope and timeline, if you need money, so funding, and then the budget for the project, as well as who could you work with, who are your partners, who's going to participate in it, who's going to be the interviewers, who's going to be the interviewees, and where do you already have relationships in your institution or outside of it, and what do you want as an end result, like what are those deliverables. So first, let's talk about your goals. So part of like working on oral history projects is determining why you want to do this and who are you documenting. So you first need to establish the goal of your project. It can be one or multiple. So is it to document someone's life, a disappearing community, your board members or officers of your local organization or the organization that you work with? Is it a cultural or political movement? Is it an event like with a protest, a historic event that you want people's perspectives on? Like, who are you documenting? And then ask yourself why you want to document it and to what extent you want to do so. And then what will the final product be? Are you going to share these on a website or in a digital space? Is it for the community? Are you sharing it publicly or privately within that community that you're documenting? And do you want it in our archives preserved for long term and future generations? So these are things to consider when you're starting out. And then think about your audience. You need to identify your audience and who this is intended for. Are the interviews intended for your personal use, for a research project, maybe assignment for your class or for your thesis or dissertation? Is it for your family? Are you working to document your family's history and you want to interview elders and family members in order to keep that history? Do you just want to share this with the community that you're documenting? Is it for the general public, or is it for a scholarly community like academics who are interested in this field and topic so they can use it for research? This is a very significant part of why people do oral history interviews, and you need to know before going in because that can inform the questions that you ask people. And then consider your scope and timeline. In terms of this, you need to consider how many interviews you want to do. It can be 1 to 100 to I would not recommend thousands. Part of that is space and storing them, but you need to know how many you need in order to get the intended end result, the intended product, share with the audience. You need to know how many you want and how many differing like people you want. Is there a timeline for this? And do you need to consider a specific time period for it? That will help you choose who's going to participate, which we'll discuss later on. So is there a time frame for when you want to complete this? Do you only have a year? Do you have however long you need? If it's part of a specific project for school, you may only have until the assignment's deadline. So you want to plan accordingly based on that. So always consider the time, and that will help you actually determine how many interviews you need to do in order to fit that time frame. And will you be collecting additional materials? For us, we like to take photos of the individual we're interviewing, but they also might bring stuff with them to share as a part of the archive. So will they be giving us memorabilia or actual documents? Will they be giving their collection to go along with this and provide the context? Oral histories are always great as a contextual piece for a collection, and having those physical material usually helps fill out the story. So, but sometimes you're working with people and getting this history because there's no other way to document their history than doing this oral history interview. So consider if you'll be collecting additional materials, especially if you're donating this to an archives. And will the interviews need to be transcribed? There are transcription softwares out there, some free, some paid. And if you use like video conferencing software like Zoom, it allows for live captioning and transcribing after the fact. But you need to determine if you have time within your time frame to do transcription, and will it benefit your intended audience if you do such. Transcription to me is always a benefit. And if you can't do transcription, you need to consider indexing, like pointing out at this point in the interview, they talk about this topic or this thing, because it helps people who may not be able to view the video or have disabilities be able to read that and access that as an accessibility point of it. But you also have to consider your audience. If it's just for you and you don't have the time to do transcription, then you just have the interviews and you watch the recordings. So always consider that when you're thinking about transcription, and consider what apps are out there for you to do such. So and next you need to consider funding, which is a big part of oral history interviews. You would like for them to be done for free, but that's not always the case. You need to think about, will you need funding for the project? Are you already funded? Is the institution you work for already doing this and have the equipment and stuff available? We'll be talking about budgeting in the next slide, but you need to think about if you need funding and how you will get it. A lot of funding can come from donors. If you're a nonprofit, you may set up like a fundraising campaign and crowdsource. You may work with different organizations to sponsor the project, especially if it's something that fits their mission and vision as an organization. They might be able to sponsor it and provide you with the money for the various things you will need for oral history projects. You may want to partner with a library, archives, or another local organization for them to either provide you with money or equipment to do such, and they can probably contribute, especially if they're taking in the recordings after the fact. If they want the interviews, they may be able to help provide funding. And then you can consider grants. Grants is a large part of oral history work and archival work in general, but that's a more involved process. It requires applying and receiving grants, and then that does have a time frame. Like you have to consider that grants last for a year, 2, 3 years, depending on the granting institution. And it's more involved and will probably require you to include other people within the process. And it takes understanding what you need and the goals. So this whole like planning process is something you would do for applying for grants. You would have to provide that information to a granting agency. So that is all that I have. And so this leads us right into the next thing, which is budget considerations, which Morna will be taking over and talking about that and the other aspects of project planning.
Thanks, Brittany. Yeah, as far as grants go, we could do a whole series of workshops just on grant writing and grant management. So we're not doing that today. So yeah, as Brittany already mentioned, unfortunately, managing oral history projects is not free. It's often not cheap. So before you embark on your journey, you really need to think about the costs. Will you need to purchase equipment? Do you need a camera, a recorder, a tripod? We have all of those. We have multiples of those here. This can potentially be less immediate of a need since we have modern cell phones, which can capture recordings. But you may need an app to record the interview. If you have a backup method, it's good oral history archival practice to have a second piece of equipment recording just in case one of the pieces of equipment fails. Now, there are some libraries that may have equipment that you can check out. However, you need to make sure that they're in good working order, because if they're being checked out to multiple people on a very regular basis, you don't know how well they're being looked after. Do you need to travel for the interview, or are you bringing an interviewer to you? Do you need to reimburse the person for gas, or do you need to pay for hotel or plane tickets? What about meals while they're there? Then we talked earlier about transcription. How are the interviews going to be transcribed? Are you doing it yourself, which takes a great deal of time? Are you asking volunteers, which is potentially free, but can be unreliable? Or are you hiring an outside company to try transcribe them? And that can be very pricey. We have used a company out of Boston, and what's interesting is the Southern accents are sometimes a little tricky for people who live in Boston to understand. So there's a lot of bits where they can't understand what we're saying. Are you using an app to transcribe? Some of them are free. They're not all great. There's a lot of cleanup afterwards when you use these apps. We like to give our interviewees a thank you gift. I've got one here just to show you. We have mugs from special collections that we take. We also have buttons and pencils and information packets about our department. Are you going to give somebody a gift when you interview them? In some cultures, it's really important that you do that, and you need to think about who you are interviewing, and is it appropriate to take a gift? But if you are, then you need to consider the price of those gifts. We always provide water. If you're traveling to somebody, you're going to need bottled water. There's the cost of just bottled water. There's all of that's added in. Do you need to rent space for the interview? You do need to have a space that you can control disruptions, minimize noise. We've done interviews in people's homes. That's not always an option. Sometimes offices are a good place, but then there's phones and stuff like that. You need a really good, reliable place to do the interviews. Will that cost you? So there are places on campus here at Georgia State, we actually have to pay to use that space, even though we belong to Georgia State. You need to think about that. Libraries, community centers, churches, they may actually provide space free of charge, but the quality of the sound and what's going on around you might not be easily controlled. So you consider that. Let's think about digital storage. You've got your interviews. What are you going to do with them? It's really important to properly preserve and access the interviews once you've done them. I can tell you from experience, these will be larger files, especially if you have video or audio WAV files, because the WAV is a good archival version. Do you have enough cloud storage available to store them all? Will you need to pay for more because that's not cheap? And how long will you need to store these files? You certainly need to store them for the life of the project, but what about once the project ends? How are you going to store them then if people need to access them? I would say this is probably a good reason to maybe donate the interviews to an archive or any kind of repository, because they are actually equipped to store interviews long term. Just be aware, an external hard drive is not a good option for long-term storage. That's just not the way we would recommend doing it. Do you want to move forward to partners? So who else should be involved with the project, and when should you consult them? For planning, administrators, archivists, the IT folks or digital project staff, legal affairs department, and members of the community you're documenting should probably all be involved early in the planning stages. For us, we do not need to go through IRB, but if you're doing a project for a class, you may need to consider IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So you need to check in with them. And they will help you figure out what needs to be done really early on, because there's a lot of planning has to happen if you are going through IRB. Your archivist can advise you about a deed of gift and a release form, and that again should be done before you even think about starting the project. During and post interview, in carrying out the interviews or doing the transcriptions afterwards, you could work with volunteers, community members, co-workers, retirees, faculty, or graduate assistants. I have just about all of those people helping me with my projects. I rely heavily on my volunteers. Who is participating in this project, and how are you going to find them? That can be difficult if you are not a member of the community. This is where partnerships can come in handy. Do you know a member of the community that can introduce you and vouch for you? I work for my gender and sexuality collections. I work with members of the LGBTQ+ community. I am a very staunch ally. I'm not a member of the actual community itself, but I have some really great advocates for my work that help build bridges to the community, and that really helps me a great deal. So you might want to think about, finding someone who can help you do that. Are you going to put out an ad? Use social media to find people? Are you going to go canvassing? There's all sorts of ways that you can find your interviewees. Think about how old the interviewees will be. I would recommend be careful if you're interviewing minors. We have to have parental consent for anything that we do when we're interviewing minors. That means that the parent has to sign the release form as well as the child, stating that they give permission for the child to be involved in this. Do the interviewees work? Because if they do, you may end up having to interview them in the evenings or on the weekends, or very early in the morning. Are they in the same country as you? I have interviewed somebody in the Middle East, and I had to get up very, very, very early in the morning in order to do that. So you need to think about all these things. Who is going to conduct the interviews? Are you doing it yourself? Are you using volunteers? Are you using members of the community? And if you are using people other than yourself, have they been trained? Do they understand the process? Because you need to put the time into actually making sure that they are trained, and they know what to expect. Just as we need to make sure that the interviewees themselves know what to expect, the people conducting the interviews need to be comfortable with the process because they're leading the process. Let's talk about relationships. Going back to what I said earlier, do you need help reaching out to the community? As I said, finding a trusted member can be very helpful in navigating and reaching people. But be aware, they may be somebody that you trust and they're a great ally and they're an advocate for you, but they may have their own biases. Are they making decisions about who should be interviewed based on who they personally think is important to their version of history? You might want to have 2 or 3 people helping you with their own sort of versions of what they think are important for history, and then who they think are important to interview. Biases can definitely color things. Do you need to recruit volunteers? As I said earlier, I use volunteers a lot. And in particular, I use them for the interviews I did around the women's marches. I put out a call on social media and in a listserv for volunteers to come help. And a bunch of mostly archivists came, and I had probably about a dozen people help me over a couple of years, interview people all over the state of Georgia. And that was incredibly helpful. But I did train them, and we worked very closely. I also have a transgender oral history project that I don't feel I am qualified to be an interviewer for. And so I, again, put out a call on social media and various other places where I knew folks could find me, asking for volunteers, not just for conducting the interviews, but also for advising me on planning the interviews. And all of the people that stepped up are trans themselves. So I have a completely trans advisory board and a trans volunteer group, and I just manage the logistics of everything. And that has worked really, really well. It's not a large group, which I think is probably good, but it's a very dedicated group, and they provide really important advice about a community that I care very deeply about, but I'm not a member of. How are you going to build connections to your community? We have to think about that just generally as archivists anyway. Are you going to go to community events? That's a great place to meet people. And if you do, will the community readily accept you, or will they be hesitant? Will they see you as somebody who's just going to these events so that you can use them for interviews? You've got to be really careful that you come across that way. This should not be you only caring for them because they've got something that you want. Will you need time to connect with the community or to build trust? That you need to build into your time frame and your planning if that's something that has to happen. I will say there's a long history of academics badly treating and ignoring minority communities. So be aware that they may not trust you, and also be aware of power dynamics. And we actually talked about power dynamics in the session that we had last week. Be aware of that and try to make sure that that's something that you address. Let's talk about deliverables. So this comes all the way back to your goal. What questions will you ask the interviewees in order to achieve your goals? Like, is this a life history, or is it only around a specific event? Most of our interviews that we do are life histories. And the reason we like to do them is because you never know what the researchers who are going to use the interviews, what their interests are going to be, what they're researching. And I'll give you a great example. Years ago, I interviewed, we have loads of interviews with women who were interviewed because they were second wave feminists. And a lot of them were born between the 1930s and the 1950s. I had a researcher email me one time saying, do you have any interviews with women who were children during the Second World War? We did not interview these women because they were children during the Second World War. We interviewed them because they were feminists who were trying to get the Equal Rights Amendments ratified. But they talked about their childhoods during the Second World War. And because of that, we were able to sort of pass these interviews along to a researcher. So, and it's actually one of the reasons why we've never really had to use IRB, is because the kinds of interviews that we conduct are very general and they're full life histories. We just want them to be as broad and as rich as possible. There are times when we do very pointed interviews. The Women's March project that I talked about earlier, we dip into early childhood so that we can provide context for folks' activism, once we get to the marches themselves. But the main focus is the march, the immediate aftermath of the march, and the hopes for the future. So there's room for all of it, but from our perspective as archivists, if you're donating the oral histories, it's probably the best ones are the ones that are full life histories. And you know, people feel like they've, as a person being interviewed, you feel like you've given everything. It's not just like a snippet. It feels like a complete experience. And, you know, I think it's a much more enjoyable, sometimes more cathartic, more satisfying experience. You need to think about, you know, how you'll obtain consent for the interviews. We talked about consent in great depth last week. That is at the very core of what we do. We don't do any interviews without making sure that the interviewees are able to provide what we call informed consent. So they know exactly what to expect. They know exactly what's going to happen after their interview, what's going to happen to their interview, what they can do with their interview, all of these things. How are you going to manage that? As we talked about last week, we make sure there's a lot of communication before the interview. We have an interviewee packet that we send out. We have phone conversations, we have email conversations, we have Zoom conversations. We have an ongoing sort of conversation about informed consent. Even after the interview, we continue the conversation about informed consent. So you need to have a plan in place for how you're going to do that, because that really is, you know, super, super important. And also, if you are planning to donate the recordings or the interviews to an archive, you need to plan for the release forms yourself. I said earlier, we can provide our release forms. We do not want to take interviews that don't have release forms. We would prefer to take interviews, and I'm sure most repositories are the same. You don't have to give everything to Georgia State, but we would prefer to take interviews that don't just have release forms, but have forms that provide specific releases to Georgia State, so that we can then do what we want to do with them, and make them available to researchers. So make sure, you know, you don't just say, tomorrow I'm going to interview somebody. You've got a chunk of time where you have to think about all of these logistical things that aren't just important for you doing the interview on the day, but are important for what you're going to do with the interview beyond that day, and what your archivists, your friendly archivists, will be willing to do with the interviews beyond that day. So think about that. What do you need to accomplish for each step of the way? You know, if you have a certain date that is your deadline, you need to start like planning backwards. You know, how am I going to get to that deadline? And I will tell you from many years of experience, you need to provide a big buffer in that time frame, because Sod's law is that at least if you're interviewing 5 people over, 5 weeks, at least one of those people will postpone, or something will happen, or the equipment won't work, or suddenly out their earshot, a child has an accident and they have to say, sorry, I need to cut this short, I have to go, something will happen. So you need to give yourself plenty of time to get to your deadline, if you do have a deadline. You also need to make sure all your forms are ready, all your sample questions are ready. If you're, especially if you're going to be using IRB, you have a lot of paperwork that needs to be done. IRB has a very specific process, and most interviews are usually exempt, or but you still have to go through it, and there's a time turnaround. So you need to go to whichever IRB is your local one, if you have to use IRB, and find out what their cycle is, because you need to put that into your cycle for planning for all of this. So, and then you need to think about what your final products are going to be. Are you just going to have, we touched earlier, Brittany touched on earlier, is like, if this is something just for your family that is, something you're keeping close to your heart, you don't have to worry too much about how, what you're going to be doing with it. Are you using this for a podcast? Are you using this for an exhibit? Are you using this for a documentary? Are you using it for any other number of different things? when you figure out what your final product is, or what potential products might be, then you have to think back as, okay, what do I need to do in order to make sure I've all the pieces in place to make this happen in a timely manner and to be fully ready to be utilized. So there's a lot of things to think about, and we've finished early, so we've got plenty of time for discussion. If anyone has any questions. We have a lot of experience with this, so we're happy to talk about anything at all.